And I would like to welcome our first session. We are going to talk about the Green Real Deal. We've been very much looking forward to this session. It will be a fireside chat with Professor Ernest Moniz. He's the founder and CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative. He's also the former Secretary of Energy. He clearly needs no introduction, but it's my great pleasure to welcome him and our moderator for the session, Octávio Simões. He's the Senior Advisor to the CEO at Tellurian. And please join me in welcoming both gentlemen on stage. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to sit here with Professor Moniz. We've known each other for some time, from the days of the MIT Energy Initiative on natural gas report back in 2011. And it's been a great pleasure to have someone like Professor Moniz involved in our industry and really contributing the way he has. So we have a big agenda to talk about things. So we'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience.
Before we start, I'll just add that, as you well know, as an advisor to that study, it started really before the fracking revolution.
That's right.
Really had blossomed, and I would say we were pretty prescient in that report.
and it's really interesting because in the spirit of what this conference has been in terms of dialogue, if you can go back and look at the report, but you'll see the people that were on it from all walks of the industry and the environmental groups and policymakers. So it was a great collaborative effort, and I think we need a lot more of that going forward in making those coalitions. So this is not about me talking, this is about listening to what Professor Moniz has to say. And what I'd like to do is start out by framing kind of the energy transition and the role of natural gas in that energy transition. We've talked yesterday about energy, environment, economy, how the three balance each other. And for energy today, we need to have it has to be available, has to be affordable, has to be reliable, has to be sustainable. But the fact is, climate change is a reality. And the facts are that the low carbon economy is something we have to get to. And there's a never increasing ambition in goals. Paris Accord was 30% reduction by 2030. Recently, it's 40% reduction with net zero by 2050. And so with that as the background, I'd like to hear your perspective on how you see all these things coming together going forward.
Well, let me comment in two ways. First, it is certainly the case, as you've said, that frankly the science and public attitudes driven in many ways, certainly in the United States, by weird weather, certainly is driven this more ambitious set of goals, both in the mid-century net zero and the more aggressive way station at, say, 2030 on the way there. The net zero, I really want to emphasize, I think it's understood, but it's really worth saying, net zero and zero are very, very different concepts. And net zero inherently means that we better figure out some negative carbon technologies at very large scale, and maybe we'll come back to that. But this net zero is accompanied by, of course, a call in many quarters for very, very dramatic and rapid elimination of all carbon emissions. And in our group, Energy Futures Initiative and Green Real Deal, what we emphasize is we really do need to go to deep decarbonization as fast as we can. But as fast as we can has to be understood, meaning doing the hard work of building a real coalition that can pragmatically pursue low carbon, that in doing so recognizes we have to address all sectors, not just the electricity sector. It has to emphasize we need a real focus on innovation because we don't have the tools for net zero credibly. mid-century, that emphasizes that we need regional solutions because there is no one-size-fits-all. We'll have very, very different. And so putting all that together that's what we call the Green Real Deal. In the context, again, of the United States, or let's say other industrialized countries, we frankly are entering, as you know, and I think everyone here does, that the future of natural gas is then becoming very contentious. The way we see it is there will necessarily be, for success, a continuing role, an important role for natural gas, call it 1-2 decades, continue to substitute for coal, for example, and lower carbon emissions. But then we're going to have to face, how do we get to that net zero? CCS could be part of this, et cetera. So we'll come back maybe and discuss some of that, but reliability, resiliency, the ability to address not just electricity, but industrial heat requirements, et cetera, we're going to emphasize that. My second comment would be that we have to, frankly, remember the words written all the way back in Kyoto, maybe not attached to a very good program, but that there are going to have to be realistically differentiated responsibilities for, let's say, the industrialized countries and the least developed countries, just to take two ends of the spectrum. And there are going to be different pathways and timescales for very low carbon. And this is also controversial, frankly, in the current discussion, that we believe, and I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal not a few weeks ago with the head of Africa 50 Infrastructure Fund, that we believe that with all the natural gas finds in Africa, more of that gas needs to be used for internal economic development. And frankly, it's economic development with associated empowerment of women, et cetera. That's what's ultimately going to lead the least developed economies to be contributors to the low carbon future.
You cover the whole spectrum of what we're going to talk.
We can elaborate.
But we'll drill down on a number of these things. By the way, I recommend everyone to download, if you haven't done already, the Green Real Deal. It's a great piece to read. It actually supports a lot of the things we're talking about. And there was one sentence that it caught my eye, and it kind of goes along with what you said, that we have to do certain things, but it has to be big enough to matter and popular enough to take place. And that's the whole thing that we were just talking about in terms of creating coalitions, minimizing costs, realizing we're going to have stranded assets and stranded workers as we move to other things. And
minimize those assets and workers.
And figure out that we have to resolve all those things. Yes, you talk about something that I know it's very key to the things you like to do and are focused on doing, which has to do with the energy poverty. And yesterday we had some presentations showing where that is prevalent in the globe and where essentially they're not looking at potential infrastructure of putting wind and solar, as you said, regional solutions that may encompass the use of natural gas or a fuel because solar, wind, and batteries may not do it. How do you view that? Because I think that's very key to this audience in terms of we all seem to realize solar, wind, and batteries is not as renewables as we think because of mining and minerals and all of those things, as we're seeing now in Wisconsin with turbine blades being disposed of from wind turbines. How do you view that evolution, or what thoughts do you have regarding the fuel that may underpin the growth of introduction of solar and wind into the different systems? And obviously that fuel will be different regionally depending on what's available.
Well, there's quite a few different questions in there, so you're risking another long answer.
That's okay. I like
but first of all, in terms of energy poverty, just to advertise first, so I'm co-chair along with the CEO of the Rockefeller Foundation, Raj Shah, who was the director of AID, and with the CEO of the Africa Development Bank, something called the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, addressing these questions. So particularly, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, where energy poverty is unfortunately very, very widespread, shall we say. And that's where, as I alluded to in that Wall Street Journal piece, we feel that the natural gas has to be part of that development. But in going forward to this net zero future, first let me say that wind, solar, and batteries will play an increasingly important role. But we have to look at natural gas, or more broadly, a fuel, and I'll use fuel in quotation marks because I'll come back to hydrogen as an example, that we are going to need a fuel as part of that system. For one thing, it's always refreshing to look at actual data. And especially in a report we did to look at California's pathways to low carbon, we have the indiscretion to put there several pieces of data. So, for example, for 1 year, we looked hour by hour at how much solar and wind is dispatched against the capacity. For wind, there was the inconvenient truth that for 90 days of the year, there was no wind in the state. And there were 10 days consecutively with no wind. You don't address those kinds of storage times with batteries. And that's not a question of getting the cost down, another factor of 2. Secondly, solar, and frankly wind as well. It's called latitude, and there's twice as much sun in the summer as the winter. If you're going to have a system based on that, you better have some seasonal storage. You look at hydro, and the drought cycles now that are increasing in California. You see drops by 2/3 over a few years. I think you know that from your previous life. So the reality is, and that's part of our pragmatic and regional solution, we need that. Now, saying that we need a fuel, and again, I use fuel in quotation marks, hydrogen could be that fuel. It has the flexibility to serve many sectors. It can be used as a long-term storage medium. If one goes to that future may very well be electrolysis of water based upon very cheap carbon-free electricity. But natural gas, since this is the gas forum, natural gas, frankly, combined then with CCS, is a logical bridge there as well to developing a large hydrogen market. Maybe it's not only a bridge, maybe it's a destination. But that innovation agenda, we should remember, does lead to a lot of different options. For example, maybe we collectively, maybe we finally solved the problem of a drop-in, very low carbon fuel, a biofuel. It's been a few decades without success, and I'm not saying I will bet on it compared to the hydrogen pathway, but all I'm saying is that the innovation landscape could lead to dramatic changes, and those have, for example, the hydrogen pathway and maybe the transition through methane reforming versus this low carbon drop-in fuel. Think of the enormous difference that implies for the infrastructure evolution. So this is we're going to need a lot of business model innovation. We're going to need, frankly, a lot of industry decision-making under uncertainty. as this whole innovation agenda unfolds. So anyway, it's going to be very dynamic, but certainly the tools are there in principle, I would argue, to get to that objective in 2050.
One of the things that I think we always find, especially in an audience like this where we have a lot of engineers or in the industry,
you mean applied physicists?
Well, those are better. When you're faced with a problem, you tend to come up with a solution for the tools you have. And what's frustrating a lot of times is we have a problem with the tools we have today lead to a solution that is being fought very hard against. And that can be, people call it a bridge, call it a transition, whatever you want to call it. And in order to get that in place, there needs to be dialogue, and there needs to be critical thinking about what can be done. There needs to be kind of a giving away of rigid positions and a willingness to bend, if you will. We see some bright spots, the Vatican and oil and gas statements that you alluded, the OGCI that has been developed by a lot of the companies. We're seeing some collaboration with some of the environmental groups. What do you think could really happen? I know in the Green Real Deal, you really make the case for strong coalition, strong collaboration, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere or do some deep decarbonization in the economy. What are your thoughts on what could we as an industry do better to foster that dialogue, to foster that cooperation, to really be able to build those coalitions, to really get those solutions that people say, well, I'm not going to do that because that commits me to something. The landscape is littered with the examples of people continuing to burn the wrong thing because they don't want to go to something cleaner with fears that it may commit them for 20, 30 years on that option.
Yeah, well, okay, again, you mentioned again, and you're certainly correct that we emphasize strongly the need for broad coalitions. I mean, I certainly don't know of any major shift in the United States, and I don't mean just energy, that has been accomplished without having a broad-based coalition. I mean, a sustainable change without a broad-based coalition. And unfortunately, our politics is so polarized that it's getting hard to have those coalitions on so many critical issues. So when we come to the issue at hand, the broad answer is, in fact, for this industry to be part of this coalition building. And some examples are, you mentioned Vatican statements, just to make that clear. In June, there were two statements which were voluntarily signed by 11 oil and gas CEOs from the United States. That included ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Occidental, with major figures from the financial industry. Again, the United States, that included, BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street Bank and CalPERS and CalSTRS, and so these are big. And then there was, and similarly, major figures from Europe, et cetera. That's a coalition. Signed two statements, one on calling for a carbon price, and a second statement calling for corporate transparency in carbon accounting. Another coalition, Environmental Defense Fund, and companies looking at methane leaks, for example, getting that down. I think a coalition building statement, even if it's not always accepted, you have to be persistent. Natural gas, again, at least for the next 10, 20 years, whatever, we have to view it as a partner with wind and solar, not an either or, that it's all part of putting together an integrated system. So, these are all the bits and pieces that we have to have as our vision, and then we have to take actions that are consistent, step by step, to get there. And I think we find, by the way, another one we find in the environmental community, for example, the notable shift towards supporting, sometimes holding their noses, but supporting nuclear power as part of the low carbon solution, et cetera. So we just need it across the board. In fact, another feature of what we say in the Green Real Deal is that maintaining optionality and flexibility is absolutely crucial. And for the innovation agenda itself, that means we better keep working on every arrow we can put in the quiver. And they are going to be drawn upon in different ways in different parts of our country and in different countries in the world.
We have put up there the wheel of the Green Real Deal, where listing the 5 principles and the 8 elements that make up the framework for action. And I like to make a point because in talking to some folks, some people are very confused about the Green New Deal and the Green Real Deal. And I'll give you the opportunity to clarify this audience on the differences between the two.
Well, first of all, the Green New Deal put forward in frankly, the one-pager that AOC and Senator Markey put out is, first of all, is very, very broad in terms of the issues it addresses. So I will just focus on the energy climate part of the Green New Deal. What we say is if you look at that one-pager and don't listen to what various people say about it, just read what it says. And fundamentally what it says is that in addressing the energy climate issue, there's 2 things to do. 1, get to very low carbon. 2, in doing so, integrate social equity issues into how you get there. Those are the principles. And we say, absolutely. So those principles are a foundation for our Green Real Deal. However, the Green New Deal, again, as put forward, does not give you a program to get there. So the Green Real Deal is what we say is, here is, the set of principles and the set of elements that we believe have to be integrated into the program. So, for example, this year at EFI, we've done 4 kind of large reports that you measure by kilograms, you know. The first was on the energy innovation, technology innovation landscape. We did that with Dan Yergin in his organization. Well, that fits into the innovation agenda. We did a second one on the U.S. energy employment report. That fits into the workforce part up here. We did the next one on the California pathways, regional solutions. Our last one was on carbon dioxide removal, large-scale carbon management. So what we say is, again, these are the principles and the elements, and now we have to do the hard work of actually bringing those into programmatic elements. And that's the distinction. Now, I am not saying that everyone who supports the Green New Deal will endorse this approach. The coalition building, the pragmatism, et cetera, but that's what we say is, this is the way to get the Green New Deal focus on low carbon and social equity done. On the social equity, if I may just give a clear example of what that means. Let's take the world, doesn't exist today in the United States, although if you want to come back to it, I will give you my optimistic prognosis that there's a carbon emissions price. So let's assume that there's a carbon emissions price, whatever the number is. Okay, let's take the example of what former Secretaries of State Jim Baker and George Shultz and their colleagues, Hank Paulson and others, put forward the so-called tax and dividend approach. For those of you who don't know what that means, what they say is put a carbon price, they suggest starting at $40 a ton, and then collect that money. It's a lot of money. It's between $200 and $250 billion a year at that price. Not a bad piece of change. What do you do with the money? What's the policy? The policy will determine whether it is socially progressive or socially regressive. They propose take the money, slice it up into equal pieces, and send it back to everybody in a check. That is socially progressive because of the equal dividend for everybody. But suppose instead Congress says, yeah, that would be nice, but you know, that sure would be a nice down payment on the deficit. That is socially regressive because any pass-through of the higher energy costs differentially hurts the poor. So there's just an example, a clear one where getting to low carbon also is going to require not just the technologies, but policies which will be determinative in terms of addressing the social justice questions.
No, that's very helpful, and I hope that everybody walks away here today with really what the Green New Deal really is and what the Green Real Deal really is. One is a set of ambitions that everybody then extrapolates to say that it says keep it on the ground, do whatever, when in fact the resolution does not say that. And
right.
then the Green Real Deal is really a framework for action to achieve
right.
those ambitions.
Right.
In a way, they may not be, yeah. as you indicate, the same as the proponents of the Green New Deal want, but that's a different story.
What we say, it's converting ambition to action.
Exactly.
How do you do it?
Exactly. I'd like to switch to two challenges before we open for questions in a little bit. The one challenge is the rest of the world. As you said, there'll be a differentiator between the industrialized nations and the countries that are developing. Some anecdotes, 40 new coal plants being built in Vietnam, a number of others in China and throughout Southeast Asia. And we can see that and say, we could actually achieve tremendous reductions in the CO2 inventory if instead we made a choice for natural gas in those areas to provide the energy and access that they currently don't have. What are your thoughts on how we, as the industrialized nations, could do better to battle that? Because it doesn't really matter what we end up doing. If we think of demographics, where maybe we're 25% of the population between Western Europe and North America in the next 15 years, then it doesn't matter if we cut 50%. The rest of the world is going to overtake that, and we're back to no resolution.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say what we'd like to see is those coal plants not get built and instead to have, again, the integrated system of gas, renewables, and storage instead. Now, to me, the reality is that you mentioned, okay, a lot of coal plants in Vietnam and India, et cetera. What you didn't say explicitly is, and China is willing to pay for those, or I mean, build them and get back, right, to fund them. And of course, that's part of their Belt and Road kind of whole infrastructure initiative. The reality is, for climate reasons, and I would argue for business reasons, we need to have the industrialized countries, that includes the United States, compete. I mean, you know, if the Chinese are going to support a coal plant, we should be in there saying, no, we can give you a better solution. But it's going to require policies to guide that and to provide backstops, et cetera. And one way not to do it, for example, has been over these last years, I mean, for example, not having the U.S. Exim Bank even function. I mean, you know, this is not a way to help industry get technologies out there and do business. So I think it's plain and simple. We have to walk the talk. and one way or another compete and make a better deal for those countries to take the lower carbon pathway.
Because a lot of us that travel around the world in our course of our business, we face a very different reality when we're in places like Vietnam or Southeast Asia, and that is they're deciding between coal or gas. So tell me what the price of gas that you can deliver, and if it's better than the price of coal I can buy, then fine, I'll go with yours, because I have an interest in having a low CO2, but I have all these people with no electricity. So
and you have an interest in exporting LNG, apparently, given your
that's right.
where you sit.
I wasn't going to go there.
I say that because I think that is right, and that, as I said, LNG is certainly, to the extent to which it's displacing coal and oil products, right, because a lot of the world is depending on diesels and there's cooking issues and LPG and the like, that I do think that another coalition, and I'm giving you a business model hint here,
appreciate it,
is that I think our LNG export businesses should really think also about partnering on integrated solutions with customers in terms of the gas, renewables, and storage. Because it's really that kind of integrated system, which I think would offer, in the context of carbon, low carbon, a good framework, especially if then in addition, and you got to, how you score this is important, there may also be, as in the industrialized countries, as we had more and more carbon policies put in place, the availability of offsets, right, which provide additional financial incentives for that. It's a transitional issue on the offsets, but I think could be a very important one, again, over the next 1 to 2 decades.
Going back to the net zero concept and we had some presentations here yesterday by nature-based solutions for low carbon. The encouraging thing is that in the last few major conferences we've attended, whether it was Gas Tech or Oil and Money, there has been absolutely no comments of, well, climate change is a hoax, or we're competing with renewables. It's actually been the other way around. It's been, this is a reality, we have to face it, we have to address, we have to clean our house to really have a seat at the table. And so we've made the strong point of in flaring and methane leaks and methane venting, so that then you have the credibility to have a role. Last topic before we open it for questions. Where you are now, you also have created a report, Clearing the Air, and it has to do with removal of carbon. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in that area? 'Cause that's also a report available, by the way, if anybody wants to download it from the website.
Yeah, so this goes back to the earlier statement that that to reach net zero is going to require substantial, and we're talking gigatons scale, negative carbon technology. So clearing the air, what we just put out a month ago, is about constructing what we think is the needed research, development, demonstration agenda over the next decade. We generally bin the technologies into 3 different areas. One is natural solutions, like reforestation. We don't discuss those, but we say that those are important. What we do discuss are the 2 buckets that entail technology-based solutions. One is technology-based solutions, like, for example, direct air capture, which has gotten a lot of attention, where you literally capture CO2 out of the air. A reminder, there's 0.04% CO2 in the air, so you got to move a lot of air to get enough CO2 out, and right now that's pretty expensive, but a lot of innovation going on. And the other big bucket is what we call technology-enhanced natural processes. So, for example, in the biological sphere, new cultivars, maybe with very deep-rooted systems. And it's interesting, new players are coming into the game. For example, in that area, as a very, very active program at the Salk Institute, which is identified with medical solutions, obviously. And another example, accelerated mineralization. I think you referred to mineralization. So that's another example. Basalt is a great medium for that. And for example, in the United States, there are very interesting formations in the Northwest and the Southeast in that category. Anyway, we analyzed 27 different portfolio elements to what we think is something that's very essential. It comes into the net zero. I mean, in a simplistic sense, what I'd say is, look, we'd like to push as far as we can in the direct mitigation of emissions. But at some point, when you start getting whatever close means, close to zero, whether that's 80%, 90%, 95%, you're going up a big cost curve. And at some point, especially with innovation success, frankly, that last way to net zero is going to need something like carbon removal. That's kind of our view. And certainly, and now this is getting, maybe it sounds like more science fiction, but if that's part of the solution to net zero, there's no reason why you can't extrapolate that to it is core to the solution of net negative zero. We're going to shoot by 1.5 degrees. It doesn't mean, in principle, that we are condemned to be there forever if we can actually go net negative. But anyways, that's why we think this is a very critical area that has gotten relatively little attention. And it's been very encouraging, the response we've gotten in terms of wanting to look at this as an important kind of a new major portfolio in the federal and in the private sector R&D efforts.
Thank you. Obviously, as you can tell, I could be here all morning chatting with Professor Moniz, and I'll be very happy. He may not be, but I would be. So at this point, we have about 5 or so minutes. I'd like to open the floor for any questions anybody may have. I see a hand right here in the front. Get a microphone. Please remember to say your name and the affiliation.
Yes, Jack Belcher with Cornerstone Energy Solutions. You mentioned hydrogen and the transition or the potential of gas to hydrogen. The Japanese are very focused on hydrogen now. What do you think about that possibility in terms of hydrogen playing a bigger role in our energy globally?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, I think there are alternatives to supplying the, quotes, fuel, again, that we need in the system. Personally, I mean, I'd like to see a broad innovation agenda, but personally, right now, if I had to bet on that in the longer term, I would say hydrogen is kind of the lead horse at the moment. And so I think a very important issue is to, of course, the hydrogen market has been growing, but I think really creating more and more of those markets for hydrogen is important. In doing so, obviously, steam methane reforming is by far the cheapest way today, but the steam reforming plus carbon capture is actually the second cheapest way today, and the cheapest way of doing it without major carbon emissions compared to the electrolysis pathway. But the electrolysis pathway will also start coming down in big ways in cost. Clearly, the capital cost of the electrolyzers will continue to drop, but the long pole in that tent is getting to very low cost carbon-free electricity. You really got to get probably sub 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And there's a lot of discussion about how excess solar and wind is free. Well, I don't think it's actually going to be quite free in this context. So what I see it is, as is, first of all, those two pathways to hydrogen. They may coexist, and in different regions, again, you will see different solutions. Some regions will not have really the capacity to have a major carbon capture piece, but regions that do have that, and maybe for a while with EOR, will go that way. So I think a key is focusing on hydrogen, getting the market to grow very, very substantially as we go forward, viewing it as having, it's like a utility player. I jokingly call hydrogen carbon-free methane, and because it serves multiple sectors, even recognizing there will be major infrastructure uncertainties even in that picture. For example, in Japan, there's a big focus also on saying that the hydrogen transport infrastructure is really through a liquid as opposed to a gas, et cetera. But those are the issues that we have to manage, and different people will take different bets in the transition.
Well, certainly Brazil at hydro at 1.5 cents would be an interesting option for electrolysis.
Yeah, and exactly. And if you're, Scandinavia has acted as Europe's battery. It could also act as its hydrogen source. And of course, on the other hand, to do electrolysis. On the other hand, Norway and Equinor, is trying to make CO2 disposal a business. They might do it through that channel, et cetera. So it's if we think we know what the low carbon economy looks like in 2050, you're blowing smoke. Right. It's the innovation agenda is going to be very, very central.
Other questions?
Yeah, that's a very good point. If you look at innovation within the energy industry over the last 30 years, where do you see the capital coming from for the new innovation and technologies you see to make this a reality? Is it the private equity? Is it the major oil and gas companies, the NOCs? There's a lot of dollars, a lot of innovation, and a lot of technology.
To me, first of all, as a general statement, it seems to me we are awash in capital that can't find good projects. And so,
today's economy.
Sorry?
In today's energy space.
Yeah, exactly, in today's space. So I think the extent to which, and I think a lot of that money is certainly seeking the low carbon investments more and more, and that's happening with new funds that are developing in the equity space. I think debt financing will also. By the way, and I'll also advertise for the sometimes maligned. Speaking of the debt financing, the maligned DOE loan program. By any sensible measure, it has been extremely successful, and not so well known. There remains $40 billion of authorization left in that fund. And I think the oil and gas companies are going to play in there as well. For the going forward, if I may go back to the carbon dioxide removal report that we discussed briefly a few minutes ago, we have in there an explicit. It's very precise, a $10.7 billion program over 10 years. It may not be accurate, but it's very precise. And in that $10.7 billion, we have $2 billion, which is more backloaded in the decade, for public-private, that is government industry demonstration projects. So presumably those would be like 50-50 cost-shared projects. So I think there's going to be a whole different set of channels for developing these opportunities. I got to say, I think once one has something that's been demonstrated to make sense, especially, and again, I believe certainly within this decade, we are going to have carbon pricing. I absolutely believe that. I'll take a bet with anybody that. And that will change the evaluation of projects. I don't think getting the capital is going to be the problem. We got to get the projects done and establish the cost basis.
Well, I'm getting the hook that we're done with our time. I really want to, please join me in expressing a really warm appreciation for Professor Moniz's presence here today.